one is the loneliest number that you'll ever do.
And now the curious case of Richard Perle. Richard Perle was one of the ideological godfathers of George Bush's policy of preemptive war, most famously and still currently on display in Iraq, of course. Mr. Perle is known for his demanding eyebrows and for his proud embrace of his nickname, which is the Prince of Darkness. Richard Perle was a former Reagan Defense Department official, for years a forceful advocate for neoconservatism, or as I like to think of it, radical international social engineering through profligate military means. Preemptive war, in other words, the Bush doctrine, attacking Iraq, for example, even though it had nothing to do with 9/11. From his perch at an influential Pentagon advisory board, Mr. Perle, along with other neocons like Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, exerted a powerful influence on Bush administration policy. Like other neocons, Richard Perle predicted that the Iraq war would be quick and that Iraq would pay for its own reconstruction. That's the history, right? We all know that that happened. We all just lived through it quite recently. But check this out. According to Dana Milbank in today's Washington Post, Richard Perle now says that not only is he not a neoconservative, he says that neoconservatism does not exist. In a speech last night, Perle said, quote, "There is no such thing as a neoconservative foreign policy." He said that even if neoconservatism did exist, it certainly couldn't be blamed for what happened over the past 8 years. Also, I am a supermodel, pigs fly, and the Detroit Lions just won the Super Bowl. Joining us now is James Mann, who is author of Rise of the Vulcans, a history of the Bush foreign policy team. He's also author in residence at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. James Mann, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Good to be with you, Rachel.
Mr. Perle is denying that neoconservatives or neoconservatism had any influence on the Bush decision to go to war in Iraq. Was this all a dream? Is there any conceivable way in which Richard Perle is telling the truth here?
If he's talking about the war in Iraq, no, that's not true. The neoconservatives had a strong influence on the decision to go to war in Iraq. Richard Perle himself was not in the Bush administration. His nickname in the State Department was the unpaid advisor, but he was extremely close to Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, and underneath Paul Wolfowitz was Douglas Feith, who was really Richard Perle's protege. So there was a strong influence there.
What was the neoconservative justification for starting that war?
The justification was that Saddam Hussein was a bad ruler and should be replaced. I should say, when he says the neoconservatives didn't have influence on the Bush administration, if he's talking about the war in Iraq, that's simply not true. I think when he says we didn't have influence on the Bush administration, there's a point at which he's being sincere, and that is, had he had his way, the administration would have been much more hawkish than it was. To take Iraq, for example, at the end of the war, if Mr. Perle had his way, the U.S. government would have set up the Iraqi exiles as the government in Iraq.
But what about this whole idea that neoconservatism doesn't exist, that it is a name invented by people who are critics of the Bush administration's foreign policy to describe a movement that didn't exist, that describe a philosophy that was never coherent enough to deserve a name? That argument, to me, is the part that seems truly Alice in Wonderland-y.
Well, the name neoconservative long predates the Bush administration. And Mr. Perle was himself at the center of a group of people who, in the 1970s, really came together from the Democratic Party originally to oppose détente with the Soviet Union, and who really stuck together for several decades. It is a close group of people. And it's true that not everybody has exactly the same idea, but there is a group of people who can fairly be called neoconservatives.
And does it survive? Does it have a shelf life and an appeal after the presidency of George W. Bush? I mean, there have been some sort of prominent defections from the movement, right?
In the short term, I would say no. I don't. I think people go off to think tanks and they they think and they write, but in terms of in terms of short-term influence, I don't think it's there. Long-term influence, I'm not even sure it's there, but who knows what's going to happen in 15 or 20 years. Right now, I think that really the neoconservative influence began to diminish at the end of Bush's first term, and now I'd say the influence is just about zilch.
I think the country would be delighted to know that neoconservatism had no future. I think the neoconservatives would be delighted for us to think that it didn't have a past, and therefore they can't be blamed for any of this stuff. James Mann, your new book is called The Rebellion of Ronald Reagan, History of the End of the Cold War. I understand it comes out in March. I look forward to talking to you about that if you'll come back on the show next month. Thank you.
Happy. Thanks.